Okay, on to trying to understand the background to perhaps some would say the most important, probably the most high profile problem in the Middle East, and that is the relationship between Israel and Palestinians. And I say high profile in terms of extent of time that it's had this status. It's this relationship between Israel and Palestinians. And the problem has drawn in much of the world and is arguably the principal reason for Muslim resentment against the West, outside of the very common institution, unfortunately, of imperialism, a very historical institution. All right, but this problem between Muslims and I should say Palestinians and Israel, between Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, has drawn in the West and the United States in particular, and so therefore there's been a lot of antagonism in the region towards the United States foreign policy, not necessarily the United States itself, but its foreign policy, because of this problem. And misperceptions and political agendas of commentators have led many to perceive this problem as a religious clash, but it is not a religious clash. That is entirely simplistic. Jews are not trying to convert Muslims. Muslims are not trying to convert Jews. Hardly. What you'll see is a problem over land. It's a geography problem. Now, it's not my intention to do a history of Jewish-Christian relations in Europe, all right, but to suffice to say, I'll limit myself to the 20th century dynamics that has resulted in changes in the map. Again, the geography class, you would expect that. All right. And it's important you understand this background, lest you not become victimized by the wealth of circus clowns on all across the political spectrum who simplify the problem here in the Middle East as if the Palestinians are bad or good, or as if Jews in Israel are bad or good. It's ridiculous. It's more sophisticated than that. It's a problem that needs to be addressed in a geography class. Okay? So let me give you a background for this problem. Here, let me get this thing set. There we go. All right. Now, like I said, this is not history class, but Jews have been a minority in all European countries for centuries. And the reason for that is something, is something that's often referred to as the Jewish diaspora. All right? A diaspora means exile, the Jewish exile. Jews used to have a couple of states in the core of the Middle East. It's the ancestral homeland of Jews. And what occurred in the 8th century and in the 6th century is they were displaced. They were exiled there were two Jewish kingdoms here. See if I can remember the names. It was the Kingdom of Judah and the Kingdom of Israel. And they were displaced, I believe first, let's not worry about the historical details. It was first by the Assyrians, who exiled them, and then second by the Neo-Babylonians who exiled them. Let's not worry about that. The key observation you want to make is that the Jews, by and large, the Jewish peoples, have been exiled or displaced out of their homeland and have thus become minorities in many countries, certainly in Europe, but also in the Middle East and in North Africa and in Asia as well. And therefore, again, to make a long story short, what the Jews have long desired over the following 2,000 years, I mean, we're talking about a diaspora, that the exiling, we're talking about the 8th century BC, the 6th century BC, and numerous other events subsequently that have resulted in the displacement of Jews and changing population flows as a function of historical events, means that the Jews have been minorities in much of the regional countries for some period of time, and Jews for the last arguably 2,800 years have desired to have a state again in their ancestral homeland, a Jewish homeland. You can, depending on what your politics, you can consider that meritorious or not. That's not my point. My point is to show you the geography of it. All right, they've long desired to have a Jewish homeland again. And so, as Jews have since been minorities in various countries, as I've sort of indicated here with this drawing here, or this image here, all right, you got Christian majorities in these countries, and you have Jewish minorities, as you can see here by the Star of David. And Jews have had, especially in Western Europe, generally speaking, a substantial amount of socioeconomic success, which on the surface has been the cause of envy amongst Christians, resulting in a pool of resentment that politicians often could harvest for their own benefit at strategic times historically. Now, I'm not going to spend time to explain why Jews have attained a disproportionate representation amongst financial sectors in the art, the practices of art. It has to do not with exceptional Jewish talents per se, but it has to do with Christian persecution of Jews. Jews were disallowed practice and participation in long-distance trade from the 6th century. Well, let's just not worry about the fineries of it. It's Christian limitations that have been placed on Jews that have resulted in Jews, by and large, focusing in things that Christians were not enforcing in terms of setting a hierarchy of privilege. In the medieval era, and as we approached in the 17th and 18th centuries, that would have been financial sectors, the practicing of art, things like this. Let's not go into the fineries. The result is that the Jews have been remarkably successful at adapting themselves to Christian persecutions or Christian discrimination. And that pool of resentment, if I had time, I'd flesh that out, has been used, as I mentioned, strategically by politicians in the Christian West for innumerable events historically. They've been scapegoated for a remarkable array of problems, for the bubonic plague, for economic downturns, for systemic poverty, for innumerable political coups and overthrows, etc., all being blamed on a Jewish minority. It's no surprise that such events traditionally result in the confiscation of Jewish wealth, whether that wealth be real or imagined, ultimately to the elite. That was the principal objective for encouraging the masses to use anti-Semitism as a tool or mechanism to persecute Jews. And this has resulted in a whole array of historical events, far too lengthy to go into here. As I indicated by this slide, the plague, the famous bubonic plague, which killed a third of Europe's population, ended up in many quarters being blamed on Jews, which is, of course, it's silly. Blamed on a mosquito, a flea often carried by a rat, but another matter. I could go through a whole series of events, and I won't do that here, spanning right on up to the 20th century. You'll be already familiar with some of them. And again, this promoted this conception of the Jew as an acquisitive individual, disproportionately seated in the financial sector and persecuting working people who are forced to adapt their lifestyles to the whims of capital. All right? In any case, let's not worry about that. I'm not going to ask you about the fineries of that. But the point being is, in fact, I couldn't help but put on here, if any of you are Shakespearean aficionados, the famous character, of which this is an insult now, by the way, the term Shylock is a character from The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which I encourage you to read. All right, he was the Jewish financier standing before the authority of Venice. Please, there's a number of good online depictions of that particular scene where essentially the Jews are asking, Shylock is, but speaking for the Jews, they're asking the Christian leadership who's about to persecute them again, all right, why do you have these sentiments toward us? As you can see there, doesn't a Jew have eyes? Doesn't a Jew have hands like everyone else? Human shape, five senses, feelings, and you get the same, the famous lines: "If you prick us with a pin, don't we bleed? If you tickle us, don't we laugh? If you poison us, don't we die?" There's this sort of macabre bemusement with the Christian fixation on the Jew. Now, I could talk about that at length. I would prefer to do so in a classroom environment, I would. But here, for this adaptation to this peculiar semester, I'll skip over that. All right. Just want to emphasize again, that the key observation you need to make ever since the biblical era, the pre-biblical era, going back 2,800 years actually from today, is that the Jews have long desired to have their own state. Because if they had their own state, they wouldn't be a minority in one of the Western states, and not necessarily simply the Western states by any means, but they're the ones with the highest profile. And that if they had their own state, they would have a governance that would protect their civil rights. Because when they were a minority amongst the Western states, they're subject to being disappropriated of wealth, often murder en masse, and generally marginalized. They don't have a government to protect their civil rights. And so you understand why the Jews have long desired to escape that type of persecution by having a Jewish governance, a Jewish state, preferably in their own homeland. All right? That extends right on up into the 20th century, which is a critical observation you need to know, because you'll see what results from that. All right? I'm putting up various images here of Jews are being denigrated and blamed for all kinds of madness. It's just convenient. In any case. All right. Prior to the 20th century, in fact, all the way into the 20th century, what I'm talking about, there have been numerous locations that have been proposed by various interests as possible new Jewish homelands. Oh, Argentina at one point, all right. Madagascar was proposed by certain interests in Europe. If I had time, I would talk about the Soviet Union and the establishment of Birobidzhan over here and whatever. There's been proposed locations where the Jews might be able to form a Jewish state, which always had some interest in the Western Europe because, again, the Jews were not exactly appreciated as a group. None of these worked out, of course. It's not as if there's not people there already. The ideal place, of course, where a Jewish homeland should be, as per the Jews, would of course be ancient Judah or ancient Israel here in the eastern, the frontage, the eastern frontage of the Mediterranean Sea, in the core of the Middle East, right there. All right, that's the ideal location. Now, here's the problem, though, with that. Let's say we're coming into the 20th century. All right, let's say it's 1900 or so. And there's still a desire by Jews to have their own state over here, and let's just use the term Palestine, in the Eastern Mediterranean over here. The reason why Jews cannot re-establish or establish a Jewish homeland here is because, as you can see, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, shall we say the Turkish Empire, is in control of the Eastern Mediterranean. It's an empire that's long been in decline. You can see by the coloring dates here on the legend over here that this empire was shrinking as we come into the modern era, into the 20th century. Nevertheless, the Turks were in control of the core of the Middle East, and therefore they are not going to allow a mass migration of Jews. Silly, they're Muslim, why would they do such a thing? Okay, so that's the circumstance at the beginning of the 20th century. There are Jews who've long desired a homeland in their ancient homeland here, and as we enter the 20th century, they still can't do that because the Turks are in control of this area. Not to mention, there are, of course, Arabs and Palestinians, or Palestinians are Arabs for the most part, all right, who are here already, so that's not possible. But let's see what happens to change that circumstance. Remember, all these things result in a radical changing of the map, so they're fundamentally appropriate for a geography class. All right, here's what occurs. World War I breaks out in 1914. All right, World War I goes from 1914 to 1918. And as you can see, the Allied powers were the powers in green here, essentially the French, the British, and Russia, with some other associated powers, including the United States. And the Central Powers was, of course, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And take note that it is Turkey over here that was a member of the Central Powers, in a sense. In other words, Turkey supported Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in World War I. And therefore, the Turks take the rest of their empire into World War I on the side of the Central Powers. So therefore, the core of the Middle East, still under Turkish control, is siding against the major Western powers. All right. Now, what occurs, as you well know already, is that the Central Powers, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany lose World War I. The French and the British and whatever, the Allied powers are victorious. What that means is Turkey loses World War I. And therefore, Turkey loses, ostensibly, its authority, however self-imposed, its control of the Middle East. And so after World War I, which ends in 1918, the core of the Middle East here, the portion of the Turkish Empire, goes over to the victors, primarily the French and the British, and you can see that here. All right? You can see how the core of the Middle East is signed over to the victorious French. The French got control of everything in this blue, light blue zone, all right? And the British got everything in this red zone and light red zone. This was called, actually, whatever, this is called the British Mandate. Let's not worry about this. The French and the British get control of the core of the Middle East, especially of ancient Palestine over here, where you, of course, is the traditional homeland, the historical homeland of Jews. In fact, to go back to this map over here, the French and the British over here and the French actually made a deal with the Turks. Excuse me, not with the Turks, with the Arabs of the Middle East in here. Notice how the Arab peoples in here are being dominated by the Turks within the Turkish Empire. And the French and the British go to the Arabs and say, hey, look, we don't want Turkey here to contribute to supporting the Central Powers in the European theater of World War I. We would like to keep Turkey distracted out of here. We'll make you Arabs a deal, you Arabs who are now being dominated by the Turks. If you rise up against the Turks and distract the Turks here to the south so that they cannot contribute to this theater of war over here, if you distract the Turks to the south, if after the war, if we win, we will give you Arabs what you've long desired. You Arabs will get your political independence. You'll be free. Support us, Arabs, said the British and the Turks, and if we win, you will be free of the Turks, of everyone. Well, that's exactly what occurred, of course, but as you can see, upon the conclusion of the war, the British and the French were victorious, but they essentially betrayed their Arab allies. Please pick up any book on Lawrence of Arabia that deals with this. Lawrence of Arabia was a British spy inserted into the Middle East, an intelligence agent, in effect, coordinating essentially resistance against the Turks. All right, that's who Lawrence of Arabia was. Well, upon the conclusion of World War I, the Arabs here were stabbed clean, politically speaking, in the back. As you can see, the core areas of the Middle East here were signed over to the British and the French. This actually occurred in the United Nations. In fact, even before the end of the war, the British and the French knew that they were going to betray their Arab allies. They did something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which you can see here. Agreement taken in 1916. Notice the war only ended in 1918, so they did this before the war concluded, where the British and the French agreed secretly, as I've written over here, the British and the French agreed secretly to betray their Arab allies and take over Arab lands at the conclusion of the war. And that's exactly what happened. So after World War I, 1918, the British and the French move into the core area of the Middle East. All right? That's the Sykes-Picot Agreement, like I said, a secret agreement. And an agreement that is derided to this day by Arabs in the region, saying that we were stabbed in the back for supporting the West and we never got our independence. The Western powers came into the core. We got rid of the Turks, now we've got the British and the French in here. All done. In any case. When the British and the French came into this area, there was a land here called Palestine. It was signed over under the British mandate in the United Nations, signed over to essentially British administration. Palestine was a land primarily composed of Muslims, who were ethnically referred, in this region, they were referred to as Palestinians. They happened to be of the Islamic religion. They were a clear majority at the beginning of at the end of World War I. Roughly speaking, Muslim Palestinians were 88% of the population, somewhere in there, give or take. And they owned and controlled an equivalent proportion of the land in this area. Okay, so they dominated. Muslim Palestinians were the dominant population here. The other major group in Palestine were Jews. These Jews weren't newcomers, just like the Palestinians weren't newcomers. Palestinians have been there for, going back, 1,300 years at least. And that's at least, if we're just looking at essentially the time of the rise of Islam. But the Palestinian ethnicity has been here for, we're talking about centuries and centuries, at least 1,300 years. We can talk to some regional scholar who can refine that observation. But there were Jews also in this region who represented about 10, 11% of the population after World War I. And they controlled the remaining roughly portion of the land, 10%. And these Jews weren't newcomers. They'd been here since the biblical era. The Jews had been exiled out of the core of the Middle East for centuries, but not all Jews were exiled, of course. So Jews have always been here. You have two populations, Palestinians and Jews, have long-standing roots here. All right. Now, we need to go into what promotes manifest political change.